Hello, everyone. For this session, I'm going to be speaking on encouraging diversity and inclusion in the open source ecosystem. My name is Zainab Abubakar, and I'm DevOps engineer at InterSwitch Group, a fintech company in Africa focused on creating payment solutions aimed at making payment a seamless part of our everyday lives in Africa. I'm also a technical writer for Jenkins organization and the open source programs manager for She Could Africa. So before I get started on what I'm going to be talking about today, I would just like to give a brief introduction or overview of what She Could Africa is, because our goals at She Could Africa closely align with what I'm going to be talking about today. So She Could Africa is a non-profit organization in Africa focused on celebrating and empowering women and young girls in technology across Africa with technical and career skills to help them excel in their various fields in technology. As of today, we've been able to impact over 5,000 African women in tech in over 16 countries in Africa and still counting. And we are constantly working towards creating a more diverse talent pipeline within Africa. So for the talk outline today, I'm going to be giving a brief introduction of the subject. I'm going to be looking briefly at the 2017 Global GitHub Survey, just to get familiar with some numbers, challenges while promoting diversity and inclusion in the open source communities, benefits of diversity and inclusion, building and sustaining diverse and inclusive communities. And under this, we're going to be looking at how to attract diverse contributors and other recommendations, and open source communities embracing diversity. These are practical ways by which some open source communities are embracing diversity. And finally, conclusion. So now to get started, open source software draws everyone from freelance web developers to tech giants into its fold, thanks to some of the benefits it gives us, which include flexibility, scalability, accountability, and some level of freedom. But open source technology also offers organizations something else, which isn't nearly as easy to quantify, and this is community. So the open source community is an essential part of the open source movement. And without this community, there will be no open source code, there will be no infrastructure to elevate it to its full potential. So the community is really, really important in the open source ecosystem. And additionally, this community operates upon a set of values that enrich both the development process and the development teams. And one of the key things in this value is the commitment to diversity and inclusion. For instance, the open source initiative has dictated some terms and conditions for any project that is to be that wishes to be licensed under open source, that wishes to have an open source license. And one of these terms and conditions is that they must agree not to discriminate against any group or person in the deployment of distribution of their code. But however, as with many professional and organizational, educational organizations we have today, it's easier said than done. And we can see that from the diversity problem we have in the open source ecosystem today. But the proof is also in the pudding, as evidenced by the results of the 2017 Global GitHub Survey among open source users and developers around the world. Now, GitHub undertook a global survey in 2017, and they surveyed over 5,500 developers. And from all these developers, 93% were male, 3% of contributors were reported to be female, 1% defined as non-binary, 7% say they are lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, or another minority sexual orientation, 26% are immigrants, and 16% are members of ethnic or national minorities in the country where they currently live. So from these numbers, we can all see that there is an underlying problem when it comes to diversity and inclusion within the open source ecosystem. And aside the numbers I earlier mentioned, GitHub further went to note how we treat each other online, and the results were really, really startling. So while 15% of male report unwelcoming language, 25% of women report the same. And the same goes for things like stereotyping, pigeonholed, and so many other things like that. Sexual harassment, where we have the percentage of women complaining about this negative issues higher than the male counterpart. So this goes to show that negativity really affects open source projects, and 21% of those who say they witnessed rude behavior in an open source project say they stopped contributing to it afterwards, while just 8% say they channel their effort via more private channels. And the truth about the matter is that the bad news is more than just statistical, because as recently as March 2019, women who ran for the board of directors at the Open Source Initiative reported digital sexual harassment, with some members of the open source community misogynistically labeling them as threats. So now all these issues I've listed above stand in contrast to what open source contributors want and what the open source community is meant to represent. However, the good news is that there are many movements out there trying to combat these problems head on many levels, but not without some prevalent challenges. So some of the challenges that have been encountered today while promoting diversity and inclusion in open source communities include not enough contributions from female and non-binary coders. So as I mentioned in the statistics I showed earlier, we have very little percentage of women involved in open source today, and this has posed as a challenge to open source communities. The dynamics of being left out. So the truth is women are often left out of group events or consciously ignored because they are not a member of the in-group, which in IT often means white men. Whether this is conscious or unconscious, it is definitely a bias and definitely makes it difficult to get involved. So open source community really need to understand what affinity bias means, which is the tendency to socialize with, hire, and promote people who are like you. And we need to really work consciously to avoid this bias. And one of the ways we can do that is by undergoing bias training. So another challenge is the sad state of women in a male-dominated world. So the truth today is the achievements of women in the world we live today is really undermined. And one example of this scenario is Katie Bowman, who was a postdoctoral fellow at MIT and a member of the team running Event Horizon Telescope. So she contributed to this project with her algorithm to capture the image of the black hole. Her team consisted of about 200 researchers, but Bowman was made the face of the black hole project because she was a woman working in a male-dominated field. She tried to clarify this confusion, but they insisted on making her the face of the project. But on the other hand, she had to deal with a lot of things like immense hatred, and even at a point ahead, I read her Wikimedia page was said to have been deleted. And all this hatred and issues she had to deal with was just because she was a woman. This is the sad state that a lot of women have to deal with in the world we live in today. Another issue we have is toxic environment. So many open source communities have a reputation of being a very harsh environment. And there are many stories from people who got their questions and contributions met with ridicule, which does not create a welcoming environment. So the expectations and the witnessing of negative interaction is one of the main reasons people give for not contributing to open source or stopping to contribute to a specific project. And several people have left open source communities because they did not feel comfortable in the toxic environment created by the lack of empathy for other people's feelings. And this is really bad. So breaking into a community that acts hostile towards members and outsiders requires a large amount of motivation. And this tends to hamper people who do not even already fit into the mold of the traditional white male computer nerd and more. So these are the challenges this is one of the challenges that underrepresented groups and women face in the open source community. Another challenge is open sexism. So in addition to potentially more negative reaction towards women standing out, there are many examples of sexist culture in open source community. Code feature jokes, variable names, objectifying and disparaging women, and sexist remarks may be acceptable behavior on even a public mailing list. And the surprising thing is, in some cases, attempts to change this culture or to remove unnecessarily offensive comments have often been met with considerable resistance by people who either are not on the receiving end of such negative comments or do not even realize that short comments that they make have negative effects on other people. And many communities, especially large ones, regularly have conferences and meetups focused around their open source project. And at these events, as well as other male-dominated events, women's experiences tend to be impacted by the presence of inappropriate jokes, others assuming they do not belong, or sexual harassment. But however, recent attention to this problem has led to an increasing number of conferences adopting codes of conduct and establishing procedures for handling incidents. Now, in addition to the more overt discussed issues above, there's also subtle and unconscious bias against women contributors. These biases are generally not the result of intentions or conscious thoughts, but have been repeatedly shown in various studies. A lot of studies have shown that pull requests on GitHub are less likely to be accepted if they are opened by women. And these same studies found no evidence for a lower quality of code in women's contribution. So why their contribution are less likely to be accepted is still a mystery. Now, this further lowers the amount of diversity in open source projects as female developers face a higher barrier towards successful contribution. The next point I have is never-ending myths. So today, in open source, we have a lot of myths about open source, and these myths need to vanish for us to get more people to get involved in open source. Some of the myths that I've heard and I'm very conversant with are things like you need to be a programmer in order to join the open source community, which is obviously not true. Another myth is that the culture and norms of the open source community is easy to navigate. However, this is not always the case, because we've had a lot of feedback where new contributors reveal that they don't get the necessary cooperation from the community members, and this can deter them from contributing. And the third misunderstanding is about the fact that you can't be a casual contributor, but you rather have to work under an open source project for your entire life. However, this is not the case. The truth is you can work according to your convenience and be a short-time contributor. Now, another barrier, the last which I have here, is English as a primary language can be a barrier to non-native speakers. So the truth is, according to a survey conducted by Mozilla, to just 21% of the respondents spoke English as a first language. And this is a barrier because most of the open source projects we have out there today use English as a form of communication and for all their materials, documentations, and everything. So this is also a barrier that hinders diversity and inclusion within the open source ecosystem. So having talked about the challenges, what are some of the benefits of diversity and inclusion? So I'm looking at this image. This is a report conducted by the World Economic Forum that highlighted the importance of diversity and inclusion at the workplace. And this report explains that when all the employees, managers, and the entire organization work under well-managed diverse teams, they tend to perform better than homogeneous teams in terms of their usual productivity. Therefore, the practice of diversity, equity, and inclusion should be encouraged by the open source community. Now, what are some other benefits of diversity and inclusion we have? This is better performance across several metrics, such as creativity, product quality, inclusivity, and making all voices heard. Proven link between company staff, diversity, and financial earnings, suggesting that there's a lot of value in diversity. So these studies generally focus on different industry and for-profit companies, but the effects shown may also contribute to a higher code quality in more diverse open source communities. Another benefit of diverse group is the inclusion of more perspective, which generally results in a product that is usable for wider audience. And various past blunders that we've had could have been avoided by simply having more inclusive teams. And some of these blunders include voice assistants that do not listen to women, or image recognition algorithms that do not recognize people of color. Now, the last benefit I have here is global impact. So looking at the big picture today, a diverse community, contributors of all ability, creeds, and experience makes a difference. You have the ability to make a difference in every community in which you operate by making a difference just in the life of your employees. Now, building and sustaining diverse and inclusive communities. So what are the ways by which open source organizations can do this? The first point I have is to adopt a code of conduct and enforce it. So a lot of us know about the contributor covenant, and this code of conduct works for safeguarding the rights of the members of the community from experiencing misbehavior and ill treatment. And it is used by prominent companies that we know today, like Google, Linux, Creative Commons, and many other open source projects. But it has really become an essential part of the open source community. But to enforce this code of conduct is really, really important. Open source projects are expected to do more than just add a README file to their to their source code repository. They are expected to be committed to enforcing this code of conduct, including dealing with problems as they emerge. And this can be achieved by having specific roles, such as project maintainer, who needs to make sure that the guidelines are followed. So this is really important. We have a lot of open source communities today that just have the code of conduct pasted in a README file on their repository, and people are going against this code of conduct, but nothing is being done. So it's very important that open source organizations enforce this code of conduct and ensure that anyone who goes against it is penalized, or there is some form of punishment for people who go against the code of conduct. And this code of conduct addresses a lot of issues within the open source community which shouldn't arise, or which can be dealt with if they arise. And some of these issues include people disagreeing about a very contentious issue, when someone checks in code that breaks an important feature, when people are unclear in their communication style, and so many other issues. So another way to build diversity is to implement project-wide strategies for toxic behaviors. So it's very important that open source communities do not accept bad behavior within the community and speak out when it happens. So make things like bullying, name calling, stereotyping, humiliation, and other negative behavior taboo in the community. So when these behavior are welcome, individuals will have to communicate with more thought and sensitivity. And the truth is, when you look at it, it's just asking everyone to act civilly as they would anywhere else, and nothing more. Next point is to build role diversity. So majority of the open source communities that don't encourage or even welcome people of diverse expertise. And the truth is, sometimes there's even no acknowledgement of them even when they exist. Coders get all the love and roles, contribution beyond coding are not even thought of, and this shouldn't be. So other roles should be as important also within the community and encourage also. So things like technical writing, designers, and even product or program managers. This is really, really important. Breaking the language barrier. So as I mentioned, this is one of the major challenges to diversity and inclusion within the open source community today. And one way to solve this problem is by prioritizing offering all key communication in multiple languages, or providing transcripts that can easily be localized. This is really important. That way, it helps you attract more diverse contributors. And this way, you even have something that contributors could work on, probably a tool that could help to transcribe your important documents, or they could even transcribe it themselves. Another point is to make it easy to contribute. So this is really, really great. And some great starting points for newcomers include things like documentation, tutorials, both written and video tutorials. They help bring newcomers up to speed quickly and participate in a way that fits more smoothly with the group. And another thing that open source communities could do to make it easy is to create small defined tasks and label these tasks as good first, things like good first issue. So when a new contributor comes on board and sees something like good first issue, they know that, okay, this is where to start. Another thing is to recognize all contributions, whether it's code, whether it's technical writing, whether it's answering questions within the community, managing, working on outreach programs, organizing events, and so many other things, marketing. And one major challenge is recognizing contributions that are not logged in collaboration tools like code repository, mailing list, and forums, such as community management and other non-coding tasks. Now, create an accepting culture. You can create a welcoming culture where new ideas and new ways of thinking or doing things is accepted. And some of the ways to do this is to welcome newcomers, make it a point for community leaders and members to reach out and welcome newcomers as soon as they join, set expectation of how members and within the community should treat newcomers, listen to the community members, and be kind. Then avoid exclusion by technical jargon. So overly complicated language tends to push contributors away. So try to make everything as simple as possible. Then design inclusive systems that protect identity. Many systems do not adequately protect the information of people who register in community portals, and this is a turn off for a lot of contributors. So open source community really need to put this into consideration. Now, how do you attract diverse contributors? Set goals and measure against them. You need to know, or you have to know, what you are aiming for if you are ever going to hit the target. Name your goals and put tracking and metrics in place so you can manage your progress. Include goals for diversity in project documentation, but don't just stop there. Communicate goals and actions to the community and ask the community to assist. Create a working group to proactively broaden the project's appeal. A good example of such a group is the Node.js Inclusivity Working Group. And this group exists to improve inclusivity and diversity in the Node.js project. Set diversity and inclusion goals and initiative for events. So work your networks to identify and invite individuals to your event as speakers and panelists who fit your diversity goals. So when you have events, invite speakers who fit your diversity and inclusion goals to speak to your community and things like that. Then also connect with other community managers to share best practice. So we have other community managers who are also trying to achieve the diversity and inclusion goal. So talk to these community members also to work on the goals, to rub ideas together. What are the things they've put in place that has helped them achieve the goals? Rub minds so you can find ways also to achieve your goals. And be proactive about reaching outside your network. Consider supporting existing efforts and creating new groups. There are things like internships like Outreachy. They're already working towards helping underrepresented groups. Support programs like this and other programs, and also expand your network. Then request that project leadership attend diversity training. So diversity and inclusion training focuses on providing the knowledge, skills, and tools for working with diverse teams to enhance performance and impact the bottom line. So this type of training is a key component and will really help the community in achieving the diversity and inclusion goals. So now, other recommendations I have include participating in internship programs to grow diversity, such as Contribution by She Code Africa, Google Summer of Code, Outreachy, or you could run your own. Provide transparency reports around diversity and inclusion, offer travel and training scholarship for project-related events, start proactively outreaching for diverse speakers at community events. Then there are some open source communities that I know of that have put in some practical steps to help them achieve their diversity and inclusion goals. And some of this organizations include the Linux Foundation. Some of the initiatives they have put in place includes initiative of inclusive naming, advancing diversity and inclusion in software engineering through their software developer diversity and inclusion project, availability of free online courses, diversity and inclusion in events, live mentorship series, and LIFT scholarship. That's the Linux Foundation Training Scholarships. Another organization which I'm very conversant with is the Jenkins organization, and this organization is also committed towards improving the diversity and inclusion within the community. And some of the things they've put in place is to remove improper language from the entire project and replace it with the right ones. And some of these changes include renaming master to controller, slave to agent, blacklist to deny list, whitelist to allow list, and so many other terminologies like that. They also participate and promote internship programs such as Contribution, Google Season of Doc, Google Season of Code, etc. to grow diversity. And lastly, they have an advocacy and outreach special interest group dedicated towards making the Jenkins community an open and inclusive organization that people want to be part of. So these are just a few practical steps that some open source organizations have taken towards achieving their diversity and inclusion goals. So to conclude my presentation, the truth is, it is difficult to totally eliminate the difficulties of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the open source community. However, consistent work and endeavor have no bounds, and as a result, it is critical to be completely informed of the situation and to work as a team to achieve this common goal. Thank you.